Have you ever stopped to think about where our ideas about democracy, rights, and even power actually come from? Well, today we're diving into the fascinating origins of political science to find out.
All right, so before we jump in our time machine, let's get our bearings. Let's start with the most basic question of all. What exactly is political science? What's it all about?
When you really boil it all down, this is the question. Every single political debate, every election, every law, it's all just an attempt to answer this one huge fundamental question. It's the engine that drives every human society.
And the ancient Greeks, well, they had a really powerful insight here. When Aristotle said this, he wasn't saying we're all destined to be politicians. No, not at all. What he meant was that living in a community, a polis as they called it, and wrestling with the questions of how to run it, that's just a core part of being human. It's in our nature.
And that idea takes us right back to the beginning, to ancient Greece, where thinking about politics wasn't just a part of life, it was something they studied systematically for the very first time.
So right from the get-go, you see this fundamental split in how to even think about politics, a debate that is still very much alive today. On one side, you've got Plato. He took what we call a normative approach. He was basically asking, what's the perfect government? What ought to be? He was like an architect, designing his ideal city in the Republic. But then you have his student Aristotle, who did almost the exact opposite. He took an empirical approach. He went out and studied 158 real-life city-states to understand what is, focusing on observation and evidence. And that's why we call him the father of political science.
Okay, so after the Greeks, the whole conversation around politics embarks on this long, incredible journey. The focus slowly shifts away from divine order and toward a totally radical new idea: individual rights.
You can see that massive shift right here. During the medieval era, politics was deeply intertwined with religion and seen as part of God's plan. Then, bam, the Renaissance hits, and thinkers like Machiavelli come along with a much more grounded, realistic view of power. Not how it should be, but how it actually works. And that leads us to the Enlightenment, which introduces this game-changing idea of the social contract, the notion that government isn't a gift from God, but an agreement made among people.
And here's the thing, even within this one big idea of a social contract, there were huge disagreements. Thomas Hobbes, terrified of chaos, argued we need a powerful ruler to keep us safe. John Locke, on the other hand, argued for a limited government whose main job is to protect our natural rights: life, liberty, and property. His ideas are basically the foundation of modern liberal democracy. And then you have Rousseau, who believed government should express the general will of the people. These aren't just old ideas. You can hear the echoes of these debates in our politics right now.
So for centuries, these are really questions for philosophers and historians. But in the late 19th century, something changes. The study of politics starts to become its own thing, a distinct academic discipline, a modern science.
And this didn't just happen overnight. It was built piece by piece. You started seeing universities create entire departments just for studying government. Specialized journals popped up, like the Political Science Quarterly, so scholars could share their research. And professional groups, like the American Political Science Association, were formed to set standards for the field. It was becoming official.
And as it became a formal science, how politics was studied changed too. At first, the approach was pretty traditional, describing how institutions work. But then the behavioral revolution came along and kind of flipped the table. It was all about, show me the data. Let's use statistics and quantitative analysis to see how people actually behave politically. But some folks felt that in the rush for data, we lost sight of the big moral questions. And that led to the post-behavioral response, which said, hey, let's use all these cool scientific tools, but let's use them to tackle relevant, real-world problems like justice and inequality.
Which brings us right up to today. So after all that history, what does this massive field actually cover? What do political scientists really do?
Well, its scope is enormous. You have political theorists who are still debating the big questions of justice and liberty, just like Plato and Locke. You have people in comparative politics doing what Aristotle did, comparing different systems to see what works and what doesn't. Others focus on how countries interact or on the nuts and bolts of how government agencies run, and many of them use incredibly sophisticated statistical methods to analyze all of it.
So, okay, we've gone from ancient Greece all the way to a modern university department. But why does any of this actually matter to us? Well, the answer is that this entire field, this entire history, holds up a mirror to ourselves. This really gets to the core of it. Political science has this kind of split personality. On one hand, it's a science. It uses data, evidence, and observation to explain the world as it is, just like Aristotle.
But it's also a normative field. It can't escape asking those big questions about justice, morality, and what our world ought to be, just like Plato. It's this constant tension between the two that makes it so fascinating.
And at the end of the day, that's the whole game. The entire discipline is built on this really powerful combination: the drive to rigorously understand how our world works, and at the exact same time to grapple with the great moral questions of how we can make it better.
And that leaves us with one final thought. And this one's for you. In this ongoing story of humanity trying to figure out how to live together, you're not just a spectator, you're a participant. So the question isn't just for the experts, it's for all of us. Which role will you play?